Laurence Gonzales is a fascinating guy whose expertise is in understanding, writing, and educating others about survival situations and what made the difference between living and dying. And if you haven't seen the first part, then please go back and watch it. But if you have, then here's the second slice of my chat with Laurence Gonzales. Could you just continue that story and just explain the subsequent events that came out of that?
Well, my recollection of it, and mind you, I haven't read this part of Deep Survival in a long time, but is that he pulled out, and a group that had launched after him came racing by him on the river, and essentially ignored the signals that had caused him to pull out, and went ahead to shoot those rapids, with the result of several people drowning, getting trapped and drowning. Um, and so I think the point that I was making was that it is possible to acknowledge that the danger has gotten beyond the level that's acceptable, that's rational, and has gone into the zone where if you go any farther, you really are putting your life at risk. But one of the things that I think came out of that story was I said, you need to do a risk reward loop whenever you're engaging these kind of activities. Even if you think you know everything is okay, you need to ask yourself, why am I doing this? What am I willing to pay to do this? Am I willing to pay my life to do this? How badly do I want to get back to see my children or my dog or whatever it is that you cherish in your life? And how badly do I need to do this right
Mm.
now? Um, and those kind of decisions that you mentioned that are made, like, oh, it's the last day of my vacation and I paid so much money for this, that's always the wrong thing to think. That's never the right question to ask. The question to ask is, how much am I willing to pay for the experience I'm about to have, and what are the risks? And so, what's the reward? What's the risk? Is something you always need to be thinking of. And some days are not summit days. Some days are not running the rapids days. There will be other days if you get home
Mm.
alive, and you'll do it again. And I think people really, really lose sight of that when it comes to fast moving water. Fast moving water is very exciting, and very cruel and unforgiving. And so the more that we think like this, the better are our chances of coming back home.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were some other factors involved because, as you say, all these various people who experienced river guides on that stretch decided to go and do it, and they had had a conversation together beforehand, so there was a degree of groupthink in there potentially as well as to whether or not they wanted to do it. And again, you don't say this, but I could imagine this happening, that you have two or three river guides, and one sort of thinks, well, if so and so thinks it's okay, then I'll go along with that, and then the other one thinks, well, the other person knows, and then you get that uniformity of decision making, which means that it will go ahead even if they might have their individual reservations, and don't be the one who resists heading out on that trip. And the river guides involved, ironically, were the ones who died in that incident. I think there were about two or three leaders who died. It wasn't necessarily the participants there. But also that there's a reverse emotional decision making from the people who went along with them, because of course if you're going with an experienced river guide, you would think that they know what's happening as well. So I guess there, if you're a participant, if things look like they're bad conditions, then I think there's a phrase that I use: if in doubt, don't go out. The gut feel is there for a reason,
Yeah,
and these people might be motivated by things other than what the situation actually is.
right. My father, as a pilot, had a lot of sayings. Pilots always have lots of sayings at their fingertips, and he would say, "If it looks bad, it is bad." That's his weather
Mm,
report for me as a young pilot.
mm,
If it looks bad, it is bad. And the same can be said of lots of different things. Anybody this past May who looked at the news probably saw pictures of Everest
Mm.
because people were going up Mount Everest at record numbers, and it's totally insane. And all you have to do, you don't have to be an experienced mountaineer to look at that photograph in your newspaper or on TV and say, this is insane. This is totally nuts. And people shouldn't be doing this. Um, at a at a smaller and less severe level, we see this everywhere that we choose to try to encounter nature that involves risk. We're going to see some little fragment of this kind of thing going on. Bad judgment. It's like drug addiction. Money just makes it worse.
Mm.
If you can, if you can afford to take more risk, chances are you will.
Yeah, and you're paying tens of thousands of dollars to go up Everest. You don't want to be turning back, do you? It's that whole summit fever thing which can be so disastrous, and it doesn't matter where you are, particularly on the water, which by nature is not a natural environment for us. We're land creatures. It's really important to make those decisions. So you've got the motivated decision making, which was made by those individuals, and people didn't pull out of that trip. You mentioned the DC-10 earlier on. I know that you've had a particular interest in that, and there's an example of a trip that you could have gone on. I think it was a book tour where you just decided, in terms of principle, that you wouldn't go out on it, and you could have gone along with the flow, but you decided not to on a point of principle, and that was a very smart decision as it turned out for you.
Yes. In 1970, I was a contributing editor to Playboy magazine. I had been the articles editor of Playboy magazine before that, but I was just having my first novel published, and it was a big deal for me because I wanted to be a writer. I didn't want to be an editor, but I had worked for Playboy for a few years as an editor, and the man who was my boss was the managing editor of the magazine, a man named Shel Wax. His wife Judy had just published her first book too, and we were all going to go to the book fair in Los Angeles. Um, American Booksellers Association convention is what it was called at that time. And I went back and forth to Los Angeles all the time as an editor at Playboy. I would go there maybe once a month or even more. And so there was nothing unusual about me going to Los Angeles, but it was my first novel, and I was very excited, and I wanted to promote it. And as we were getting ready to go, I checked on the flight that they were booked on because I was going to go with them. We had four people from the office going. And Judy were going. Our fiction editor, Vicki Chen Hader, was going, who was a friend of mine and I liked very much. And our foreign rights editor, Mary Sheridan, was going. So all these people were going together, and there was no reason why I shouldn't have gone with them. I knew them all. We could sit together, and flying with my boss, Shell, I probably would have gotten up into first class as well. So, there was a lot of incentives for me to go. However, starting as I mentioned, in about 1972, I had been investigating airline crashes and specifically the DC-10 for all those years. And I'd published several things about them. And I knew that plane very well. I knew that it was a bad plane. At the time, aviation in the United States and in the Western world in general was extremely safe. And the planes were unbelievably reliable, more reliable than you would expect, mathematically speaking. They were just terrifically reliable, except the DC 10. The DC 10 was the only plane in the skies that just routinely fell out of the air because it was flawed and it was designed badly. And there was a whole history of this, why this turned out the way it did. But it came back to the parent company, the McDonnell Douglas company. Anyway, in the course of getting ready to make this trip, I hadn't bought a ticket yet. I said to Shell, you guys are going on a DC 10. I don't think I can go with you because I just know too much. It just, scares the bejesus out of me to think about getting on that plane. And he was like, "Oh, you've been reading too much. Just, it'll be fine. We take that flight all the time." And I said, "Yeah, well, you take that flight. I take the 747 made by Boeing." This was the old Boeing, not today's Boeing, because there was a 747 to Los Angeles once a day as well. And I said, "Well, Shell, I don't think I can do it. I don't think I can get on that plane." And I remember standing by the elevators. We were on the 10th floor of the Playboy building in Chicago, the old Palm Olive building, which had Lindbergh's beacon on the top of it for flashing Lindbergh as he flew by on his famous trip. We were at the 10th floor, and they were getting on the elevator to go take the plane. And I said, "I'll see you guys, and I'll get another flight, and I'll see you guys." And Shell and Judy were like kids. They were holding hands. They were going to have a big time in Los Angeles. And I did whatever I did. And as I was driving home, I had the radio on, and I heard the news that there had been a plane crash at O'Hare, our Chicago airport, that they would have gone out of. And I thought, no, that can't be true. But I kept listening, and sooner or later they began to tell details about this crash that I knew it was them. And I was out there the next morning covering it. I tried to get there that same day, but I couldn't get anywhere near the airport. But the next morning, I was there, and the pieces of the airplane were the size of the biggest pieces I saw were, a wheel, an engine. Everything else was just shredded. They never found Shell, my boss. Um, and so that's another one of those events in my life that, like my father's crash, was like I really came close to being dead. I came very close. I mean, this was a guy who was very influential on me, telling me I was being silly, and I had worked for him.
Mm.
And I wanted my career to go forward, and my first novel was coming out. I I don't know how I made that
Yeah.
decision. I think I made it because that plane literally scared me.
Well, yeah, I guess it's acting on what you know rather than and engaging that conscious side of the brain rather than the emotional and being sort of pushed into it or influenced into it.
Well, I think that's true, but I think also I had spent so much time studying the DC-10 and the accidents and
Mm.
the deaths that it caused that I had literally hooked the whole thing to my emotional system, and it
Mm.
scared me. So it was like I'm afraid to get on this
Mm.
plane. So in addition to the knowledge I had, which is important, I had that little extra emotional boost that can really help us if we're in a situation like the river rafters we were talking about. Seeing those standing waves on that water might have that
Mm.
effect. Like, hey, I'm scared to get in that water.
Yeah.
It's dangerous.
Yeah, and it does tend to be the more experienced, certainly from the paddleboarding world, the more experienced people who have sort of experienced the edge of some of those conditions that tend to be more obsessed with safety than, new people who are just opening their paddleboard for the first time and think, what's the worst that can happen, but they haven't sort of encountered it, and obviously it isn't ingrained in them as much as it is for the more experienced people. But as we know, sometimes that even that isn't enough. I just wondered whether you could just talk us through a second water-based incident. And again, it was running a river, and this was about an army ranger who had gone out on a rafting trip because he had a sort of an excess, I guess, of confidence in his ability to survive in that environment, but he didn't really understand the environment.
Right. The Army Ranger training is different from much other kind of training in that if you have to be rescued, you're out of the program. Being rescued is a sign of failure. And so while he was very competent in all kinds of ways from that training, this one training, they call these training scars, like the FBI agent who snatched the gun out of the guy's hand, he had a training scar that he didn't know about that only presented itself in an emergency. And this guy, whose name was Gaba, fell out of the raft. The raft, I guess, tipped over, threw everybody out. uh, and he was in the water, and his guide was in the water, and his guide moved to rescue him to help him, get off to the side. And Gabba stiff armed him, pushed him away, and laughed at him, basically enacting something that he would have had to have ingrained in him during training, which is don't rescue me, man, because I want to go through with this training and I don't want to get kicked off. And unfortunately, he was in an environment that was over the top of his abilities, and he was then swept down river. And I seem to remember that he was trapped by a rock, but but he did drown. And and one of the lessons that I use this for is to let people know that somewhere in all of us there are these kinds of training scars. There are things that we have let ourselves learn that we don't realize we've learned, and they will come out under high stress in the right circumstances. And once again, accidents are not simple, they're complex. So it has to take a whole bunch of different things have to line up just right to not only bring out the training scar, but to make it have consequences like death. Um, and so it may go unnoticed for a long time, and just be waiting for the right set of circumstances. So we have to try to kind of observe our behavior more carefully under stress to see what comes out so that we become aware of it.
And I wanted to ask you about sort of male versus female risk taking. I mean, I know that sort of young men, particularly, are particularly prone to taking unnecessary risks. But are there sort of different sort of cognitive patterns run by males and females that put each sex at sort of particular risk versus the other?
Well, statistically, it's fairly easy to point to um, testosterone as a culprit. And since males tend to be higher on testosterone than females, there tends to be a skew in the statistics toward males being in accidents more and being in risky situations more. Having said that, there's no shortage of women who engage in these risky sports or risky adventures, if you will. You know, there's just a ton of them, and often they're the best at what they do. Lynn Hill was the best rock climber in the world in her day. Patty Wagstaff, who's a stunt pilot, an aerobatics competition pilot, was the best. She was the world champion in her day. So when women decide to do these things, they often do them better than men. But more men, I think what you might fairly say is that more men make poorer decisions while doing
Mm.
these things, especially young men who haven't quite uh, evened out the competition between reason and
Mm.
emotion, tend more toward the impulsive, which tends more toward the accident. Um, and so it's a field of intense study that's very debatable and often debated. Um, but just in terms of the numbers, you can point to like auto accidents, for example, will show you that more young men get in auto accidents. Um, but I think the interesting part is when you examine really high achieving females like Patty Wagstaff and Lynn Hill, you see when a woman decides to do one of these things to the nth degree, it's often way more impressive than when men do it. There are plenty of exceptions to that too. Alex Honnold, the free solo climber, is an example of that. He has no amygdala though, unlike the rest of
Yeah,
us.
that's that can be both an advantage and a problem, can't it? And you're right about taking that qualified. And in the paddleboard world, certainly in the UK, some of the longest, sort of wildest journeys have were led off by women. The first two people to run, the classic route in Great Britain, which is from Land's End to John O'Groats, were women. It took a bloke 2 or 3 years later to actually go and do the whole circuit. But I guess I guess in terms of sort of emotional control and not being driven just by hubris and testosterone, that's the real danger. People don't know what they don't know, and that's a lot of the problem. Um, so, so you mentioned one of your other books, which is Surviving Survival, and that book's about what happens after that acute survival situation. Because generally, the coverage and the curtain closes after they've got back to safety. But people are left with, as you mentioned, post traumatic stress, which is an understandable or extreme reaction to all the stimulation and so on that they've had. So I know that in that book you talk about some of the sort of potential, I wouldn't say solutions, but sort of therapies and so on, or directions that people can take to help manage that sort of trauma. Could you just sort of talk about some of the examples that you've got in there?
Yes. So the human creature is made up of many push-pull systems, as I call them, like the emotion and reason that we talked about before, where one thing dampens another, and the opposite happens that way. One of them has to do with it's another survival response. There's a portion of the brain that's referred to by many neuroscientists as the rage circuit or the rage pathway. And it's a pathway in the brain that takes you through several different areas of the brain. And it's easy to visualize this circuitry and what it does if you simply step on the tail of a cat. Accidentally, of course, but we're all familiar with what happens if you accidentally step on the tail of a cat. The claws come out, the teeth come out, the screaming, the struggling, all of these behaviors are meant to release the cat from entrapment, which it feels. So by stepping on its tail, you've activated this circuit in the brain called the rage circuit. All mammals have this circuit. We have this circuit. If you stub your toe, you'll see this circuit in action. Okay, so it serves a function. It gets you free from, a predator, supposedly. There's another circuit that we can illustrate with the cat, too. When the cat is stalking prey, it's not screaming, it doesn't have its claws out. It's being very steady, it's being very quiet, it's being methodical, goal oriented, it's going slowly, and it has to do that. It can't be raging, or else it'll never catch any prey. So it has to do those actions in the proper way to catch prey. And it just so happens that that circuitry, which is called the seeking circuit or the seeking pathway, goes through the rage circuit. It occupies some of the same real estate, so it shuts off the rage circuit. So this is a good thing. If you have an experience, like a traumatic experience, like some of the ones we've talked about, the woman who was attacked by the bear, um, you may have post traumatic stress reactions that activate the rage circuit when it's not appropriate. So you may have anxiety attacks, you may be, hyperventilating, you may be unable to sleep, you may have all of these different activities going on around in your head that shouldn't be going around in your head because you're living in the past now. You're not living in the present. And if you can find something that will activate your seeking circuit, it'll shut that off. So in the book, Surviving Survival, which is about this subject, I tell the story of a woman who actually is somebody I know. She's a novelist named Anne Hood. And when Anne's daughter was 5 years old, she died of a sudden, unexpected disease. She was a perfectly healthy 5-year-old girl who just died from a bad disease, and very quickly and unexpectedly. She hadn't been sickly or anything. And this destroyed Anne's life. I mean, quite literally. She couldn't work, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat. Her marriage was falling apart. She was crazed all day long. And she went to visit a friend of hers um, in this terrible condition that she was in. And her friend said, I'm going to teach you how to knit. And this friend took her to a knit shop and got her some stuff to work with and taught her how to knit. And Anne wrote a book about this, actually, a couple of books about it. And she said that knitting calmed her down for the first time since her daughter died. And she knit sometimes 8 hours a day. And she gradually recovered what passes for a normal life through knitting. Now, in the book, Surviving Survival, I talk about people who found that same relief from post traumatic stress through golf, through playing a musical instrument, through running, through other sports. There are all kinds of activities that can activate this seeking circuit and give you relief. It just depends on who you are, and you simply have to find it for yourself. I do know that for my part, there were many things that gave me that kind of relief, writing being one of them,
Mm.
which was lucky
Well,
for me because
yeah.
I made a career out of it. But also, I noticed that, in bad times of my life, if I went up in my little airplane and started doing loops and spins and rolls and all that, I certainly never was thinking about my credit card bill while I was doing
Well,
that.
absolutely.
So there are all kinds of activities that can give you this kind of relief, and they work.
Absolutely, and it's something that we've seen in my sport in stand-up paddleboarding because it seemed to absolutely take off after the COVID lockdowns. So I suspect that people use that as some degree of therapy. And again, like you said, certainly when you're starting, you don't do anything automatically. You're just concentrating your attention on trying to stay on the board, and you can't think about your shopping list or any other concerns. You need to be completely dialed in, and you've kind of answered one of these sort of residual focuses that we've had on the show because we've had an organisation called SupVets on who basically do rehabilitation for veterans through sup surfing, and we've had a number of discussions about mental health issues and how sup has been such an incredible therapy for them. So yeah, that's certainly. I mean, maybe for your next book you can add stand-up paddleboarding to the list.
Love to.
Excellent. And so, look, you've been incredibly generous with your time, Laurence, and it's been a fascinating chat, as I expected. I just wanted to finish with practical applications of this because your books are incredibly readable, absolutely fascinating. All the links will be in the show notes to this episode, and I would like to represent in terms of messaging your work in the UK because I think it's really important that these human factors are represented, and I don't think they are, frankly. I think people just go down the formulaic equipment and knowledge route and they just don't get into the detail of the human element. But in concept, it is quite complex. I mean, we live in an Instagram world where a one-line synopsis and that won't really cut it in terms of human factors. So I wondered, first of all, on an individual level, for people listening to this, what sort of things could I do in order to practice whatever skills, thinking clearly under pressure and so on, so that I'm pre-prepared for making the right decisions in the right conditions?
Well, what I always tell people is that the things that they do in their normal lives when they're not stand up paddleboarding or something of that nature are the key to how they will react in a stressful or dangerous situation. So you have to begin more consciously observing your own behavior and seeing if you're capable of this kind of mindfulness that I talk about in these books. Um, For example, you're in your car, you've got a child in the back seat, you're trying to cross a busy street, and there's no openings, and it just goes on and on. And the traffic is coming and coming and coming, and you think you feel this building up inside of you that pretty soon you're going to just give up and you're going to make a dash for it, and to hell with it. And well, or are you going to stop and say, I have a child in the back of this car. Whatever happens to me, I better not hurt this child. I think I'll just turn around and go a different way because this traffic is bad and I'm not going to take a risk that might hurt this child. I mean, it's things like day to day things like that tell you in an emergency out in the wilderness, how are you going to react? People do not invent new behaviors in emergencies, they revert to the behaviors they've been practicing all their lives. And so, if you're the kind of person who when you're stuck in traffic, you pound on the steering wheel and yell and scream at people, you have a problem that's going to come and bite you in the wilderness if you get in trouble. And that problem is that you are literally letting your rage circuit out of control. So, one of the things that you have to learn is emotional control, and a lot of people don't have it. Some people naturally have it. My father naturally had it. He was a calm
Well, not
guy,
surprised.
which, given his
Well,
experience, is a
absolutely.
little surprising. But he was he was a very even keeled guy, a very funny guy too. And the more that, and meditation helps. For example,
Mm,
in this life, there are plenty of things to be annoyed and upset about and cause anxiety about in this world, um, and it helps to back away from them from time to time in whatever way you can. But the more that you can practice your own emotional control and observing how you do or do not manage that, the better off you'll be because you'll be able to think. I mean, thinking clearly is the key to all this.
exactly. And makes me think about the England rugby team in 2003. Probably not familiar with their World Cup win, Laurence. It was a formative experience for me. But one of the coaches there had an acronym which was TCUP, which is a very English abbreviation there, but it stood for Think Clearly Under Pressure. And he trains that within his team, and you see it within all sorts of sports teams. It's let's do the next right thing, and then do the next right thing, and just deal with it in a sort of micro element. And absolutely right, you can train yourself to think more clearly under pressure. Final question for you: there are lots of bodies that regulate adventure sports and so on. Just wondered whether or not you had had an experience of a particular sport or a discipline or an organisation, it doesn't have to be recreational, who have taken on the concepts of human factors in safety and taken it forward. Because certainly from my experience, it seems to be a bit of a sort of rarity, really. And human factors can overwrite clearly everything else. So obviously it's a really important thing to get behind.
I don't. I mean, I think it's a very largely ignored part of the picture for people doing the kind of sports we're talking about. Now, the military has very good human factors research organizations of various kinds, and NASA has some as well. So there are places where this is taken seriously and being studied. Um, but in general, in terms of the kind of things that your average listener or viewer is going to encounter in recreational terms, I don't see very much going on that's comparable to what I like to talk about. Um, I will tell you one last story that I think is germane to what we've been talking about, and it's about a cross country skier. And I didn't get this into the book, into Deep Survival, because I heard about it too late. It was about a guy in Grand Teton who was taking a solo wintertime cross country ski excursion that he had done before. It was not a huge route. It was, you know, something that he could handle. And he was an organized hiker, skier, etc., smart guy. Went out, and about 5 miles out from the parking lot, he broke his ankle. He just came down a little slope the wrong way. The ski twisted, and it cracked his ankle in a spiral fracture that was just a really bad break. And he went down. And so he knew that he was in big trouble because no one was going to come down this trail. He knew the trail to be remote, and he deliberately took that route because it was remote, because he liked it. But he knew that it was 5 miles back to his car, and he had no way to get there. He didn't have anything to use for crutches. He had all his equipment, but that didn't necessarily help. So he did something very interesting, which I want your viewers to hear about. And that is, he set up his tent. He got in his tent. He got out his stove. He made himself a cup of tea. Then he cooked himself a meal. And then he started taking inventory of his gear, one thing by one thing, and he decided, I don't need this, I should probably take this. And he very carefully used his thinking part of the brain to reduce his emotion. So he was both organizing his escape and he was controlling his mental state to very effectively, simply by this organized behavior. So when he had done with all that stuff, first of all, he was refreshed. He had rested. He had hydrated. He had eaten. So he had better energy. And then he decided that the only way to get out of there, was to scoot along his butt out of the, for the 5 miles. And he decided that the only way he was going to be able to do that was to dedicate every 100 moves to something or someone he loved back in his life. So he would dedicate 100 moves to his wife. He would dedicate 100 moves to his guitar. He would dedicate 100 moves to his cat, and so on and so forth. And he did that and got himself out. And I cite this story because it has all the elements of the perfect survivor. He just did everything right. And and when it comes to that, another guy you can read it, your viewers can read about in Deep Survival, Steve Callahan, who was shipwrecked at sea for a very long time and behaved the same way. He did everything methodically and thoughtfully, and he lived because of it. And so that's the message is we need to do that in our lives, not just in an emergency. Because in an emergency, we're going to do what we practiced. So practice being a survivor in your daily life.
So there we go. Fantastic. Thanks so much for giving so generously with your time, Laurence. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honour to speak to you. I know you're obviously in the midst of another book, so appreciate you giving your time to us, and obviously hugely appreciate the incredible and fascinating work that you do and have done, and we'll share links to your books, and we'll continue to talk about your work because it's absolutely essential. And like you, I can't understand why people don't know about this, because it's likely to make a huge difference to people's safety, particularly when they're out there in the woods or on the water. So thanks again, Laurence. Take care, and I don't know whether I'll see you on the water. That's my normal sign off, but maybe see you in the air sometime. We can fly loops round each other.